Good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I am the director of the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you for joining us today to discuss Ukraine is Not Dead Yet, a recent book by Megan Buskey and her research of 20th century Ukraine through the lens of her family's history. A few housekeeping matters to go through before we get to the talk. I encourage everyone to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our new Russian language blog, in other words. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X and the Russia File. Also visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection on the Wilson website for the latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. For those of you watching today, I am pleased to announce that we have a discount code to use when purchasing the book online. You can use the code, and it's all in caps, WILSN, for a 20% discount at checkout on the Columbia University Press website. For our virtual audience, if you have a question for our speaker, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when asking a question. I will begin by introducing our speaker. Megan Buskey is a writer who has contributed to the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the American Scholar, NPR's All Things Considered, and other publications. A former Fulbright Fellow. She has been studying and writing about Ukraine history, politics, and culture for nearly 2 decades. She also is a former editor and columnist at the Wilson Quarterly, the flagship publication of the Wilson Center. Megan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Will. I can't see. Are my slides up?
Here they come.
There they are. Great. Wonderful.
Okay.
Thank you. And again, thank you, Will, and thank you to the Kennan Institute for having me. As Will mentioned, I'm a former editorial staff member of the Wilson Quarterly, and it's really delightful to be back at the Wilson Center, albeit virtually. So I think we can go to the next slide. Before I kind of get into the meat of my talk, I want to just give everyone kind of a quick overview of my book, so you have that context going in. So my book is really focused on the experience of my maternal grandparents in Ukraine and Siberia during the 20th century. So my grandparents were born in Western Ukraine in the 1920s, and they were part of the generation they were kind of just old enough to have their lives completely upended by World War II. They both experienced, various sort of terrible things during the war, which the book goes into, and I'll get into a little bit later. They survived though, and were subsequently exiled to Siberia for 20 years. They spent most of that time working in coal mines. You can see a photo of my grandmother there in the center in her coal mining uniform. In the late 1960s, their exile sentence was canceled, and half of my family was able to emigrate to the United States due to having family members here before the war, and half of my family returned to Ukraine. So my book kind of narrates all of this history and kind of tries to reckon with it. So that's just the background for people before I get into some more basic things. We can go to the next slide. So I want to start with this, just a simple kind of claim that Ukrainian family histories are incredibly important. And I think it's probably not going to be much of a surprise to people on this webinar that, history was quite manipulated during the Soviet period. Any events that sort of challenged the Communist Party's competence, its moral authority, its even just like kind of preferred narrative of things were downplayed or just kind of stricken from contemporary debate and from the historical record. So that meant that things like, purges during the Stalin era, the Gulag, the Holocaust, the nuclear catastrophe at Chernobyl, these are all things that were just almost taboo, were taboo to speak about during various parts of the Soviet period. I think an important or like an interesting and sort of telling indication of that is that the word famine was only allowed in official Soviet press in 1987, and that was more than 50 years after Stalin's agricultural policies killed more than 3 million Ukrainians. So as a result, there were really big holes in Ukrainians' understanding of their own history. I think we can go to the next slide. This played out also at the individual level. So people faced, Soviet citizens faced repercussions, some of them sometimes being quite significant, for having experiences in areas that were taboo or illegal at various times under the Soviet state. So that could mean things like having been a German POW, having served in the Nazi administration during the Nazi occupation, or having been supportive of Ukrainian nationalism. Or you could have, or just even being related to somebody who had one of those experiences. So this quote, I think, is a sort of a telling quote that captures this from Svetlana Alexeyevich's book, The Unwomanly Face of War, which is a collection of oral histories of Soviet women during World War II, their experiences in combat. The consequences was that some of the biggest consequence of this was that people often kept silent about their experiences. And this was a silence that existed in the public space, as you can sort of see being gestured to in this quote, but also privately. And I think in particular, parents often did not tell their children about what their experience was like during the war. Again, with the idea that they wanted to protect them from having knowledge that might make them somewhat vulnerable in the Soviet system. I think another thing to keep in mind is that I think trauma also played some part in that as well, that people experienced extremely traumatic things during World War II that were just very difficult to talk about. But the net result is that in a lot of Soviet families and Ukrainian families, children often didn't have a really good understanding of their family's history. And this was in part, again, to protect the children and to allow them to be able to participate fully and naturally in Soviet public life, like my little aunt is doing here, posing with her schoolmates in front of some Soviet propaganda posters. We can go to the next slide. Of course, all of this changed in 1991 with the advent or the fall of the Soviet Union and the creation of independent states, including Ukraine. Soviet era taboos fell away. Free speech became more or less protected. But the sort of grappling with history and sort of creating a new history was just one of many things that Ukrainian society had to deal with in the fall of the Soviet Union. Societal and institutional restructuring was happening at virtually every level. It's really only been, I would say, in the past 10 years that efforts to systematically collect, understand, and critically examine Ukrainians' past experiences have happened. So I'm happy to talk about that a little bit more in the Q&A if people are interested. But I think the takeaway is that this work is still quite new, and it's also still maturing. We can go on to the next slide. So that's just background for, the backdrop that I was sort of writing with or as part of in my own book. So why did I decide to do this book? I am American. My maternal grandparents are Ukrainian. My mother was born in the former Soviet Union, but I grew up in the United States and was born here. I was very close to my Ukrainian grandmother growing up, however. And as I got older, I got really interested in understanding both my heritage and her own life experiences. When I was a teenager, I started going to Ukraine. I learned passable Ukrainian, and I learned, I met a lot of my family members that had returned to Ukraine from Siberia. in the 60s. And that was an incredibly important set of experiences for me. Ukraine has become a really big part of my life in various different ways. And when my grandmother died in 2013, I wanted to put everything that I knew about her life together for posterity, for my family's own recollections. And I ended up kind of embarking on a really big research project that was centered on her life essentially, but also started to kind of move out into other bigger questions about Ukrainian history and Ukraine's future. Can go to the next slide. So when I decided to write this book, I took a lot of different approaches to doing the research. So I think the most important thing was that I spent a bunch of time in Ukraine interviewing family members about their memories about the 20th century, in particular World War II. I'm there in the photo with my aunt Naska, who's my great-grandfather's youngest sister, who still lives in the village where they both were born in Western Ukraine. I also did a lot of archival research. I was able to obtain KGB archives or KGB case files on my family members that detailed their activities during World War II. But I also obtained archival information from archives in Germany and Poland and the United States. I'm also happy to talk about that in the Q&A if people are interested. And I also did a ton of reading, and I think that's also like a really important part of my process. There's so many wonderful historians that are writing really interesting work on Ukrainian history, both in Ukraine, of Ukrainian American, or Ukrainian Americans, or people who are not ethnically related to Ukraine at all. And in my book too, I have an extensive sources section for people that might be interested in, engaging with some new sources that I'd highly recommend checking out if you're interested. So that's just kind of a background of how I ended up approaching the book. Can go to the next slide. So one of the first major settings of my book is the village of Staryava, which is my family's native village, or my grandmother's native village. It's a small village, probably about 1,200 people these days. My grandmother was born there in 1925. It's in Lvivska Oblast, about less than 10 miles from the border with Poland. It's fairly close to Chemysh, for those of you who know the geography of that region. Before World War II, it was a multi-ethnic village, but predominantly Ukrainian. There were, however, significant Polish and Jewish minorities. I think I sort of spend a lot of time in the book going into, what life was like there and the different socio-political conditions that influenced life there. But I think the most important things to know about it was that, or to know about it now, is that it was beautiful, as you can see in the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. It was largely agricultural, and it was very, very poor. And the poverty was something that affected everybody in the village, no matter what your ethnicity was. The life there was of a degree of kind of misery that was almost shocking to me as I went through the research, and that poverty really shaped the lives of the people there, and it also shaped how they imagined their futures, and it pushed many people to leave, including very faithfully my great-grandfather. And I think the next slide is, I'm going to read just a short excerpt from the book that considers what, as I mentioned, a very fateful twist in my family's story, which was my great-grandfather's decision to temporarily leave this village in order to earn some money for his family. So I'll just be reading a short excerpt of the book now. While the developments of the late 19th century diversified the kinds of food Ukrainians ate and the clothes they wore, those changes didn't translate into a wholesale improvement in living standards. In fact, Ukrainian Eastern Galicia, which is the region that my family was from, remained abjectly poor. The most desperate time was usually the fast that led up to Easter, when the catch of potatoes and sauerkraut sustained families through the lengthy winters began to run out. Those who didn't die of starvation were, quote, frail like straw, wrote one memoirist. An obvious explanation for this state was that the agricultural practices of the peasantry were stuck in the Middle Ages, literally. An economic historian of the period observed the scythes, sickles, and other tools used by Galician farmers in 1850 were, quote, exactly the same as those used in the 13th century, end quote. Every year, the average agricultural yield in Galicia was the lowest in all of the provinces of the Austrian Empire. Add to this the fact that the farms in Eastern Galicia had developed in a patchwork fashion, so that a family would have 5 or 6 fields scattered throughout the village, and it would take hours just to get to and from them. Peasants considered children a blessing, but they were also an economic asset, a way to expand the labor pool available to work the fields. When these children became adults and married, it was common to divide the land their parents owned equally among them, if, of course, the parents had been lucky and wise enough to own land. Would-be farmers could expect little from the plots that resulted when a property was divided into 10 or 11 sections among the siblings. A new opportunity dawned that changed all of this: the United States. The dire economic realities of Galicia had propelled its peasantry beyond its borders in search of work for years, but only in the mid-1800s did those desperate or brave enough elect to make the long trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Migrants usually stayed just a few years and could make as many as 5 trips in a lifetime. Before I began to study my family's history, I thought of their emigration to the United States as a single moment, an irrevocable jump from there to here. That was the myth of Ellis Island, right? You broke upon the shores of America and you were here. Who would go back? It turns out a lot of people did. That was my great-grandfather's plan. In 1922, at the age of 24, my great-grandfather, Mihailo, had married a striking young woman from Laposhnica, a village just west of Starjava. Rosalia Prokopiak was stunningly beautiful, with high cheekbones, full lips, and crystalline eyes that she described as gray in her official documents. The eldest child of Ukrainian farmers and 4 years younger than Mihailo, she was straightforward and confident and is said to have taught her new husband to read. She was so self-possessed that her younger sister used the formal you, ve, when addressing her. Per tradition, Rosalia had come to live with Mihailo at his father's house in Starjava. It must have been crowded, as Mihailo's set of brothers and sisters was growing. His mother had died a few years before, and his father, Stepan, still in his early 40s, had remarried, taking as his second wife a fellow villager named Tatiana. Rosalia and Mihailo yearned for a house of their own. Stepan and Tatiana ended up having 4 children together, which, with Mihailo and Rosalia's eventual 3, meant that a simple 4-room Ukrainian hut had to accommodate at least 7 children, not to mention a number of adults. Work abroad would give Mihailo the ability to earn more money in a few years than most Ukrainian farmers would earn in a lifetime. It would mean not just a house, but fields to farm, fields that could sustain his family for generations. Leaving would have its costs, however. Rosalia would be alone to tend to their small children. Even if Mihailo would be gone just a few years, they might not remember him when he came back. My great-grandparents must have fretted about how his absence would shape their young family, what they all would lose. By October 1929, the decision had been made. Mihailo would go. He couldn't have known then, no one knew, that the prosperous America he anticipated was about to begin a decade-long plunge into an economic depression of unprecedented scale. The photo in the passport that was issued to him that month shows Mihailo as a slim-faced young man, slim-faced man with a trim mustache and confidence in his eyes. On October 29th, he was in Warsaw, receiving a visa to immigrate to the United States. By November 11th, he was in London. Just 1 week later, the SS Leviathan brought him into New York Harbor. He was 31 years old. It's hard to know whether the financial crash that fateful autumn would have given Mihailo any pause. Even if the news did penetrate his universe, I'm not sure that the US stock market collapse would have held any meaning for him, a Ukrainian farmer barely literate in his own language, to say nothing of English. Even if he felt some concern, if he had some inkling of the extended calamity that to come, he would have been an outlier. At the time, the severity of the crisis was far from obvious. On November 18th, the day Mihailo arrived in the United States, The New York Times led with news of a Federal Reserve Board report that showed that despite the unprecedented stock market dive the previous month, wages in both the industrial and agricultural sectors were holding strong. The hardship would only become apparent with time. As Mihailo traveled to Cleveland to meet his brother, his plan was finally in motion. By being in the United States, he was that much closer to going back to Starjava, to being able to give his family the life he wanted them to have. But it wouldn't be a year or two before he returned, not even 5. More than 30 years would elapse before Mihailo would see any members of the family that he had left behind, and some he would never see again. Okay, let's stop there. We can go to the next slide. So what happened? So a significant chunk of my book looks at the fate of members of my family during the Second World War. I was particularly interested in my grandmother's experience, as I've mentioned, Anna there on the left, but I was also interested in the lives of her contemporaries. So I looked very carefully at the lives of 3 men that she was close to: Osip, who was her first husband; Andrei, who was my grandfather, her second husband; and her elder brother, Stefan. As I delved into this work, I wanted to be able, I think, to answer the question of like what happened to them, to all of them, in kind of a simple single sentence. I wanted to be able to summarize their fates, and perhaps the fates of all Ukrainians, and just, in one sort of fell swoop. But as I looked carefully at these stories and researched these people's experience, I realized that that wasn't possible. These men, while all being ethnically Ukrainian, of roughly the same age and being from literally the same place, had vastly different experiences during World War II. One of them was arrested by the Nazis for petty theft, sent to Auschwitz, and died at Mauthausen concentration camp. Another was conscripted into forced labor under the Nazis and spent 3 to 4 years in various parts of the Third Reich working. Another voluntarily went to Germany when the war started to work as a migrant laborer, ended up returning to Ukraine, joining the Ukrainian auxiliary police under the Nazis, which was a terrible institution that helped implement the Holocaust in Eastern Galicia, or in this part of Ukraine. And then this person also ended up joining, or was probably already a part of, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, where he was a member of its security service, which is commonly known by the acronym SBE in Ukrainian, where he also contributed to atrocities against Ukrainians, at least Ukrainian civilians. So as I learned about trying to more about who these men were at a personal level, the possibility of trying to kind of assign their status, assign them a status of victim or perpetrator, became even more remote. Violence took many forms in these men's lives, and again, just sort of scrambled these distinctions between good, bad, victim, perpetrator. The takeaway from all of this, and maybe the central takeaway of my book, is that there isn't sort of a central narrative about kind of what the Ukrainian experience was like in the 20th century, or in particular during World War II. It's extremely complex, and I think best approached at the level of the individual. Can go to the next slide. So how can this help us understand, this current moment better, and understand, Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine? It's no surprise, I'm sure, to those in the audience that Putin has been using history to justify his invasion. This is, something that he's been doing for a long time. This is a quote from 2014, shortly after the protests on the Maidan, where he links the protesters on the Maidan to followers of Stepan Bandera, one of the leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. He's been particularly interested in connecting the current Ukrainian government, whoever's in power, it doesn't really matter whom, with the wartime Ukrainian nationalist movement, which does, I think, have a very complicated and checkered record and did collaborate at various times with the Nazi administration and uphold sort of anti-Semitic and bigoted policies. But I think having a nuanced hold on Ukrainian history, sort of understanding, the way the different forces of history acted on individuals helps us understand what is and is not true in terms of the propaganda that's coming from Russia about the role of history in this invasion. I think it also will help us, understanding Ukrainian history better also helps us understand why these ideas might have some traction in Russia. Next slide. I also hope that my book will help people to understand too that, and this is also a central part of this horrible war. It's really important to understand Russia's behavior in its near abroad, and to understand, over time, to understand the dynamics that have led to the current invasion have not been at play just for the past year or for the past 9 years or for the past 31 years of Ukrainian independence, but have a much, much longer history. And in conclusion, I also want to share that my family story is by no means extraordinary. Every Ukrainian family has stories that feature these kinds of elements. And as Ukraine looks to kind of reorganize itself in the wake of this horrible war, I hope it will recenter itself on the stories of its own past to both understand what its past was and what kind of country it should be in the future. So I will conclude there. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. For our audience, if you do have questions for our speaker, you can submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation by sending questions. This was just such a remarkable story. And for someone who has some context with the region, the ability for you to not only track down your relative, but to see them and to kind of get their entire history and story was really quite remarkable. I want to begin, though, by kind of dealing with your grandmother, who you talk about much in the book, and how she experienced the United States in Cleveland. How was she able to assimilate? Did she have certain actions or so forth that really stood out? How did she respond when she got to the United States?
She had, I think she was able to, I think, thrive in the United States in a way that she hadn't in any other chapter of her life. So when she came to the US, she didn't speak any English, but she did have family here. Her father, obviously, she was able to get a job in a factory in Cleveland that didn't require English language skills. And she spent, I think, 20 years working there in that factory. And on the basis of that job, was able to send her two younger daughters to college in the US and kind of on into middle-class security that she was sort of elusive or a dream for her. And that was extremely important to her. She also was able to join a thriving Ukrainian community in Cleveland, which is still really a really strong and special one that I was in part raised in. It's a place that's usually centered on religious life. She was very devout, and she was a member of one of the Ukrainian churches in Cleveland. And it offered a huge community and sort of opportunity for social belonging for her. She found incredible meaning there. She had so many friends. And I think, by the end of her life was really able to, she had a life that was so full in so many ways, and so much so that she told me that she would often look back at earlier chapters of her life being in Siberia, especially those first that first year or two when things were really difficult, and she couldn't even really understand that it was her life, that she felt just this like disconnection or disassociation to some extent from that experience. So I think in some ways it's a testimony of how difficult her life was in its early chapters, but also a testament to how much she was able to achieve here as an immigrant.
And I just want to follow up a little bit more as to the reaction to your relative when you arrived in Ukraine. A American woman who was just trying to understand where she was from. Obviously, they contributed a lot of information, but how is their reaction to when you arrived to Ukraine?
Yeah, so this was a long time ago. This was, when I was like 19 or 20, when I first started going to Ukraine. I was in college, and this was really before I started doing any of the work on this book. I just started this book about 10 years ago. But at that point, I was really just motivated by a desire to understand my heritage better, to understand these relatives that had sort of been floating around in the ether, I think, to some extent, or to a large extent. And I think it was very interesting to come at that time because my relatives had a very powerful reaction to my coming to Ukraine. I mean, my mother left behind, my mother and my grandmother left behind one of my mother's sisters, and my mother's eldest sister, and then my grandfather also lived in Ukraine. My grandparents had divorced, and he had gone back to Ukraine when my grandmother had come to the United States. And it was very interesting for me to be able to go because I felt sort of like a representative of these people that my Ukrainian relatives had lost through the process of Soviet immigration. This is now a long time in the past, but to leave the Soviet Union in the 60s or 70s, it was really to be totally cut off from everything that you left behind. I think when they were leaving in the late 60s, they truly believed that they would never see anyone that they were leaving behind again. And that turned out to not be true in some cases, but obviously the world order shifted dramatically within a span of like 20 or 30 years. But it was still a huge severing. And I think it was very traumatic, I think, for members of my family, particularly my aunt and my grandfather. And so for me to come back, even though I really didn't have a relationship with them myself, I was coming obviously as representative of my mother, of my grandmother. And that was, beautiful, but also, I think, really difficult. And in some ways, I was a symbol, I think, of all the time and love that had been lost in those intervening years. So it was very interesting. But I would also say, too, that they were, just in terms of the research and like their willingness to contribute, they were very, I think so many of my relatives have helped me with this work. And, my aunt, again, in particular, went with me, I don't even know how many times, back to Suryava, and helped introduce me to people, help kind of like answer questions, help me communicate with people in case they didn't understand my accent. And, people drove me over town and, helped me fill out archival requests. It was really kind of a team effort in a lot of ways. I'm very grateful for them. And I hope that they got at least some enjoyment out of it as well.
Great. We're going to start taking questions. If you have a question, please send them and submit them via the Q&A function on Zoom. The first question is from Hiroyuki Nishina. What is the influence of Ukrainian migrants to the U.S. to nation building democratization of Ukraine?
Ukrainian migrants to the U.S. to nation building and democratization of Ukraine. Well, I think there's a couple of different ways you could look at that question, or you could talk about that historically, and you could talk about it now. I would say, just to characterize the diaspora in general, it seems I'm not in no means an expert in diasporas, but it's always struck me that the Ukrainian diaspora is particularly well organized and involved in Ukraine, contemporary Ukraine, whether now or 20 years ago or 40 years ago or whatever. There's just a lot of pride, a lot of kind of emotional investment, and diaspora organizations have been very instrumental in contributing to various aspects of nation building and democracy and so on in Ukraine. I would say that's probably even a different phase of that that's been happening over the past year with the Russian invasion. There's a number of different organizations, particularly, obviously, I'm most familiar with the ones in the US that are providing a lot of support in all various different facets to Ukraine. Of course, that pales in comparison to the work that's actually happening within Ukraine. But for those who are interested and who don't know, I think that probably the best organization is Razom, RAZOM, if people are interested and want to look them up. I think that's a great organization and certainly worth contributing time and resources to if people are interested.
Our next question comes from Sonia Bilaskevich, and she asks, can you speak more about how you dealt with those conditions while writing? Did you encounter situations where contacts or relatives did not want to talk about their past or share certain stories with you? And how did you negotiate these delicate situations?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a couple of different things to say kind of off the top. I think, first of all, it was sort of interesting to me, just like as like a literary nonfiction writer, that there are some people that are just like to talk more than others. Like my grandfather in particular was like very difficult to interview. Like he just wouldn't, he didn't like give me a lot when I tried to ask him questions. And I'm sure that also had to do with my sort of skills as an interviewer to some extent. But there are other people that when you ask them questions, they really kind of like just go off on tangents and just can even just tell a story from start to finish. My grandmother was one of those kinds of people. In terms of, so that's just sort of like a craft note, but in terms of dealing with difficult stories, I think I mean, I guess like, I'm not sure that I have a very sophisticated answer, except to say that like, you do try, I did try to approach those things as sensitively as possible. I interviewed several people several times over several years, and tried to kind of triangulate a bit what I heard. I also tried to like follow people's leads, and if there seemed to be things that they were uncomfortable talking about, I would try to respect that and sort of back off. And I'm sure there's stuff that I didn't get because I took that approach. I'd also say that like some of the most difficult things that I discovered were things that probably nobody knew, and I found in archival documents. So that was also kind of something of a workaround around those issues. But I think too, I'm not sure, there's a woman named Marta Havrishko who's done, a Ukrainian historian who's done a ton of interviews with people around their wartime experiences, particularly women. And there's not a piece that she's written about this issue that comes to mind. But I'd also point for people that might be interested in doing this kind of work and interested in kind of thinking about how do I prepare myself for difficult interviews. I think her work might be a good direction, or it might be interesting to look at what she's done or what she said about this topic, because she has really extensive experience, particularly in the Ukrainian context. And her name's Marta Havrishko.
Thank you. The next question comes from Michael Keys, and he asks if you can say more about how your ancestors ended up in Siberia and where specifically they were. Did any of your family end up staying there?
So my family were exiled in 1947 as part of Operation West, which was an initiative the Soviets undertook to remove family members of people they suspected were part of the Ukrainian insurgent army or the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. So these were not people that were contributing to the effort. They were just related to people who were. And the logic was that if you get rid of the families of the people who are fighting, then the fighters won't have as much support because they were often supported kind of with food and so on from their family members. You also sort of get rid of the people that are most likely to be the most anti-Soviet in that region. So that was about, I think, one of the biggest deportations of Ukrainians, and it was about 76,000 people that were deported over 2 days, I think, in 1947. I'm not sure exactly if all of those details are right. But my family was sent to Western Siberia. So they were in Chelyabinsk Oblast, in a very kind of barren coal mining town called Evangelinsk. They were there for about 20 years. None of them stayed. All of them returned. And that was definitely an experience. I mean, I haven't gone to Siberia to try to find any Ukrainian or descendants of Ukrainians who were initially deported. But as I understand it, it was very common for people to want to leave and go back to Ukraine as soon as it was logistically feasible. And it was logistically and legally feasible were sort of two different things, which I also go into a little bit in the book. But, again, if my family's experience is any testament, everyone did return to Ukraine or went to the United States.
Our next question comes from Daniel Whitman, who is also a fellow Clevelander. And he asks, many Americans have turned their previous image of Ukraine upside down since 2014. What aspects of the current Kremlin narrative require corrections or in some cases acknowledgement?
It's kind of I guess a sort of a difficult question to answer, especially because it's very sensitive. And I don't know if there's consensus necessarily, or I don't know that I'd be able to sort of provide a consensus summary of what the Kremlin's propaganda is about Ukraine, because it's very extensive and takes different forms when promulgated by different people. I mean, and it also where to start. I think obviously kind of at its, some of the central ideas that the Kremlin has tried to communicate, that Ukraine is not an independent state. It is not a separate state from Russia. It does not deserve to exist. Ukraine is run by Nazis, etc. All of that is, I think we all know, kind of patently absurd. However, like as my presentation points to, there are some reasons that some of those ideas are in circulation in Russia, and there's a complicated history behind them, including, for example, I think one of the things my book gets most into is this idea of Ukrainian nationalism, sort of the more ugly elements of that, and then the idea that there were people in Ukraine that supported and worked on behalf of the Nazis, which was true. And again, my book sort of just explores that. I don't think that anyone in Ukraine is at least on, that I think most reasonable people would also confirm that that's the truth. But for people that are not as familiar with the country, I think books like mine, and there's other books out there that do similar things, help explain the complexity of what happened and will help you sort of be able to pull apart, at least on that dimension of the question, sort of why some of these ideas are in circulation, what some of the, some of the activities were that happened during the war, but also why that's not what's happening in Ukraine now and why it's not related to the current Ukrainian government.
to follow up on that question, you provide a very interesting and detailed summary of your family's history during World War II. Much of it, I think, was not your family was not even aware of. So how did they react when you talked about your difficult family history? And how did you try to reconcile that history with everything that you experienced in Ukraine?
I mean, well, just to get to the latter point, like, I don't think that I needed to do much reconciliation. I mean, it's in the sense that, like, you know, World War II was a hell for people, for everybody, in a different way in that part of the world. And the idea that people would have divergent paths and relationships to that horror, which might include participating in various kinds of state institutionalized violence or state violence, was not like a foreign concept to me. Like, this idea that that could happen wasn't a foreign concept to me. The idea that it happened within my own family, again, just didn't, it was very displeasing to find out that information, but it wasn't like didn't sort of shatter my understanding of human nature. So I don't think I had to, like, it wasn't like it totally changed my understanding of Ukraine. I already knew Ukraine was a very complicated place. That's one of the reasons that I love it so much. I think, though, you can say all of those things on a theoretical level, and then it's another thing to get a case file of a relative and be like, okay, this person likely contributed to the deaths of, you know, for example, Ukrainian women and children, or implemented the deaths of Ukrainian women and children. And that's a different process. And, you know, having to have those conversations with my family about that, too, is something that's led to divergent reactions, and obviously is all happening too within the context of this terrible war. But I think in general, what I would characterize the reaction as being is, you know, a certain degree of just like disbelief, some denial, but then also like a sort of contextual understanding of, like, the war is very difficult. You know, in my book, I try to provide an account for what led people to take these different actions. And I think there's a certain amount of acceptance of it, but also it is still very difficult. And it is, like, it's supposed to be difficult. Like, it shouldn't be easy. I think it shouldn't be easy to have these conversations. It shouldn't be easy to accept this kind of information, because it's horrible. So I don't want to, you know, whitewash it and say, oh, everything's fine now. I mean, it's something that I know I think about and wrestle with still.
Our next question comes from David Falk at the retired University of Maryland. And he wants to learn more about your family's contemporaries with whom you hung out with in Lviv and elsewhere. What are their lives and prospects? If you could just talk about the family that remained behind.
Yeah, so I'm very close to a number of my, like, cousins and second cousins. So in Lviv and Truskavets, which is where my aunt lives. And, you know, in the context of this current war, some of them did leave the country after the war started. All of them have returned. I have some more, like, distant cousins that have not, cousins with smaller children. But for the ones that I'm closest to, I think there is a sort of, and this is probably just extrapolating for Ukrainians in general, and I haven't been recently, so all of this, please take with a grain of salt. But there, I think, is what I'm understanding is like a sort of sense of normalcy has returned, but it's a very altered sense of normalcy. I think there's, people get used to a lot, including this idea that, you know, people, their peers, their people that they love are serving in the army, risking their lives, in some cases losing their lives. I think that's a very difficult reality now for many Ukrainians, including, you know, my loved ones. But you know, the people that I'm close to have not lost their homes. They haven't had to like radically change their livelihoods. So there's, you know, some appearance of a certain kind of normalcy, I would say. I don't know how good an answer that is, but.
Our next question comes from Greg Yost, and he has a question about the role of the church in all of this. Did it serve as a repository for all of these aspects of cultural and familial heritage, or were the Ukrainian Orthodox, Ukrainian Catholic, and other churches so compromised, coward, etc., that they did not get involved in the story that you tell?
So I think there's sort of two different ways to look at the church question. One is just to consider the role of the church in Ukrainian American life, including, you know, 100 years ago when this story essentially starts. And I think throughout that time, as I described with my, you know, my grandmother, the churches have played a really important role in sustaining Ukrainian cultural life, religious life, providing a haven and a hub of community for Ukrainian Americans, and you know, has taken various kind of provided some support to political causes in various guises. Some of that, yeah, I'll just stop there. I think in general, it's like a very positive convening social force. In Ukraine itself, the church, the story about churches is more complicated, I think. In Staryava, the village, my family was very involved in church life there. It was also a place where like there was a lot of crossover between, and this is, I'm starting to get a bit out of my depth, between the religious like elite and sort of people that were more supportive of nationalist ambitions for Ukraine. And that also seemed to have been at play in Staryava life before World War II started. So there was crossover between, you know, the priests and the nationalist leaders in the village. And how that all played out exactly, I don't know. I don't have that information. I do know that the church was closed, you know, with the advent of the Soviet period. It was targeted because it was thought to be kind of a place where nationalists got support. And then during the Soviet period, people were prohibited from practicing or observing religious traditions. So I can offer that as like gestures towards an answer to that question.
Thanks very much. Next question comes from Glenn Wright, who's interested to know how you came up with the title of the book.
Thanks, Glenn. So the title of the book comes from a poem that inspired the Ukrainian national anthem. So I chose it because I thought that it spoke to sort of multiple levels of Ukraine, like how Ukraine functioned in my family's story, obviously as a place, you know, as a geographical sort of national place that, you know, my family was very kind of involved with and shaped their lives, but also as a place for my grandmother that was, I think, very difficult for her in many respects. And there was a way in which sort of the trauma of her early life in Ukraine sort of carried over throughout the whole of her life. So it's a gesture towards that. It's also a gesture towards you know, my own sort of experience as a Ukrainian American who wants to return to Ukraine and has kept alive this idea of Ukraine and my American family's, you know, mind space. So it was, I chose it for all of those different reasons, not of course knowing that the literal reason or the literal interpretation of the book would have the most power at this time.
Our next question comes from John Woodworth, and he says, asked during Ukrainian independence since 1991, to what degree did Ukraine's history during World War II contribute to the civic divides and voting patterns in Ukraine in the various elections? He goes into more detail, but if you could talk about a little bit about the role of World War II and history in current civic affairs.
I'm sorry, what question was that? Oh. Okay,
John
I'm
Woodward.
looking at the question because it was quite lengthy.
Yes, I've tried to narrow it down a little bit.
To what degree? Yeah, I mean, I think that's a complicated question. I'm sure there's a good dozen dissertations written on this topic, John. I think, you know, just to kind of gloss it, broadly speaking, I think there's a, and to really, I mean, I'm almost a little bit reluctant to say like there's a certain correlation between Ukrainian language speakers and Russian language speakers, and then, you know, the political forces that they supported over time, and also how that maps onto a certain kind of experience during World War II, just because I find people invoke those ideas so, you know, so readily. And I think the reality is so much more complicated that you would find, if you find free thinking people in all parts of Ukraine, just as you would in the United States. But I think this question of to what extent did Ukrainian history contribute to political convictions? I mean, I think political convictions are shaped by a lot of different things. History is one of them in Ukraine, but I probably would say it's probably not the biggest set of contributors to politics or to political thinking. It's, I think, again, just sort of broadly speaking, this idea of like orientation towards Europe, towards Russia, that seems to be more of a dividing ground. There's a sort of history that follows from each of those orientations that does certainly treat World War II in part, but it's not exclusive to history by any means.
We're coming to the end of our discussion, but I have one more question for Megan, and that is, what advice would you give people who are actively trying to find their roots? Is it it's clearly not a straight line, as you have demonstrated in your book, but what are the pitfalls and the advantages and the joys of looking deep into your family history?
I mean, I found it to be like one of the most meaningful experiences of my life. I think maybe the thing that has been among the most powerful for me is really starting to feel like the presence of my great-grandparents in my life in a way that I would not have been able to know. I didn't know them. I mean, I was a really young child when both of them died. But I can see the structure of the life that they set up for my mother, for my grandmother, and therefore also for me. And that being able to feel that connection has been extremely moving, extremely powerful to me. Like, if there were anyone that I could meet in my life, you know, if I could just meet anyone in the world, for example, like I would, or in time, I would want to meet them, because my sense of relationship to them is now so strong because of this work. And I think that that's really cool. And I also will just shout out for anyone who's Ukrainian, wants to learn more about Ukrainian American family history research. I'm going to be doing a presentation tomorrow about how to get into all of this stuff. And it's going to be through the Columbus Public Library. If you look at my social media, I'll be sharing a link out to that. So I'll be going into more detail about approaches, logistics, sources, and so on.
That's great, because several people asked about your sources as well, so that would be a great help. The book is, I'm going to show it up one more time, Ukraine is Not Dead Yet. And for those of you who have enjoyed this discussion, you can go on to the Columbia University Press website, and with an additional discount, all caps WILSN, you can get a 20% discount off your at checkout. So thank you very much, Megan, for telling your family story. It was, as I said, a great read, and for all the audience, we look forward to having you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Phil. Thanks, everybody.